Hello, sweet listener. How are you? Welcome back to A Brit, a Brat, and a 25-year gap, our second episode. I'm Cecilia Capehart-Bullen. I wanted to start off by saying thank you for all the feedback from the first episode. It was a lot of fun doing it, and I'm glad that we got great feedback and people were listening in.
Hi, this is Matt Bullen, and I've got a chuckle in my voice today and a spring in my step. Oh no! And you'll find out why in a second, but Cecilia's quite right. Feedback from anyone is tremendous. You know our email address, aBrit&aBrat@gmail.com. That's just aBrit&aBrat@gmail.com. No ampersands, no hyphens, nothing at all. And if you're using the YouTube version of this, you can put the comments below, as usual. Yeah. Two groups especially. One is a subreddit on age gap relationships that has a tremendous amount of followers, tens of thousands. You know what it's like, Cece. You put a post out there about whatever it might be, a podcast in this case, and you don't necessarily know very well, the regular correspondence or the posters, and you're a bit nervous. And I could not have picked a more tremendous, positive, supportive and thoughtful group of people. So thanks to them for their feedback. And thanks also to a Facebook community group that I approached that's quite local to us.
Yeah. It's good. Always good to get something back when you put it out there.
Yeah, and again, the feedback there was very useful. That's the main thing, is that it was useful. People seem to have enjoyed the first one. We would say that, wouldn't we? But it's true. If that's not the case for you, if there's anything you think we're missing or you'd like us to improve on, by all means.
Let us know.
Yeah. Now, before we go back to I suppose it wasn't cheaply intended as a cliffhanger, but before we get back to where we were in our own age gap marriage, which is part of the point of this podcast, I said I had a spring in my step, and here's why. What we want this podcast also to be about is life's little age gaps, life's little time markers, time lapses that any of us spot everywhere. And we really want you, whatever they are, whether they made you happy, reflective, a bit sad, bittersweet, whatever, just let us know about those. And here's an age gap theme for you. Cece's looking at me askance because she knows what's coming up is a sort of two-in-one story about an age gap in my own life. And the theme of this one is the boy is the father of the man, all right? The boy is the father of the man. And these two stories are quite true, but the second one compounds the first, and you'll see why. By the way, also later in the episode, Cece and I share a couple of thoughts on how our different ages might affect our views of social media. Here's a taste.
It's good to live in the moment. And sometimes when you're with people and they're trying to take a picture for Facebook and post it, it changes it. They're not just with you anymore. They're with all the people that are going to see the picture. And is this the right one? And it robs you of being in that moment because maybe you're at Disney World or maybe you're at a winery or whatever. And you're like trying to just have a good time. And it's like, oh, we got to get a photo for Facebook to kind of prove that we actually went instead of just being there.
But for now, back to my two stories in one. So, when I was about 11 or 12, my dad, who, if you remember from last week, my late father was a journalist, and he took about 8 years off his profession to run a small antique store. Very small, like collectible items. Not what you might think by the word antique, not grandfather clocks and dining tables and things, but small collectible items. Now, at about that time, he let me help out for the equivalent of about $5 or $6 on a Saturday morning, when I was, again, about 12 years old, every week in his antique store. It was about the time that I was applying to a rather posh school, what turned out to be my high school. Now, I don't know if, I think in the States from shows like Downton Abbey, you guys know the term public school, right? Which is, apart from what its name suggests, is actually rather a posh set of schools like Eton, Charterhouse, and so on. I was applying to a day school, so it blended into the town, but it was officially a public school. If anyone's interested, the only difference between British public schools and any other private school in Britain is that public schools are members of an association called the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference. That's the only difference. Okay. And so one day, there I was, working with my dad in the antique store, and this rather imposing-looking gentleman walked into the store one day. Something about what he said to my father made me think that he was a governor of this rather intimidating school I was about to start at. he was on the board of directors or something like that. I seemed to sense my father giving me kind of an edgy look, a sideways look. And I thought, how am I going to impress this man? What can I do? So I watched him like a hawk, everyone. I watched him as he roved around our little shop, and as he inclined his head towards this thing and that. I thought, time's running out. He looks as though he's going to get ready to leave. He selected some items. He came up to the counter, and mercifully, looking towards me, he stuck his hand out. I thought, this is it. This is my opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, I shook that hand like there was no tomorrow. And I said, how do you do, sir? It's so nice to meet you. Thanks so much for coming to our little store. It's lovely to meet you. And then I gave him his goods. He left, giving me, I thought, what to my mind was a rather impressed look. A bit startled, perhaps, but very impressed. And I looked up at my father, beamingly. He looked at me incredulously. And he said, Matt, why did you do that? And I said, well, obviously he's a governor of the school. I was meant to impress him, right? And he said, Matt, I've never set eyes before on that man in my life. He was just a stranger, buying a few postcards.
Oh, man.
That's the first story. I'd just vigorously shaken hands with a guy, a little 11 or 12-year-old, pompous little so-and-so that I was, that my father had never met before. Okay, hold that thought. That story you think, oh, right, Matt, it's not that good. Cut forward 30 years. And sadly, very sadly, my father by now is dying. And I mean, dying. It turned out to be the last few months of his life. We took a trip to my hometown. We got off the bus one day going to my mum and dad's home. It's in a row of...
meaning you...
and a friend of mine were visiting. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, it wasn't me. We had not met yet.
Yeah, so it wasn't Cece and I. So a friend and I, who was actually there on the trip to give me a lot of support, she did too, bless her. So we walked up to what, to all intents and purposes, are a row of cottages. They're not really, they're houses, but they look like what you might think typical English cottages with a nice little front yard, little footpath and so on. And we were just coming up to Mum and Dad's house, and I had heard Mum and Dad praise their neighbours, especially the next door neighbour, very heartily, because Mum and Dad got so much support during my dad's illness. So as we walked up to the front door, I saw their next door neighbour come down the footpath. And I hadn't met him before, but I thought, well, there's lots to do on this trip, so may as well get things out of the way. I thought, I'll just stop and say thank you, because I'd been only finding out about all this by phone, living in Seattle. So I stopped this gentleman and I said, sir, I'm sorry, I don't know you, you don't know me, but my name's Matt, I'm Peter's son. Things aren't going great, but I said, I know you've been a tremendous help to Dad. I just wanted to say thank you. I said, I know it's not easy. I don't know how long you've lived here, but I know it's not easy just knocking on someone's door and starting a helpful friendship like that. So I just wanted to say it's a difficult time for all of us, but thank you very much. And I shook his hand. And he listened very patiently to my speech for about 30 seconds or a minute. And he turned to me and he said, Matt, I'm very, very grateful, but he said, I'm just here to read the electricity meter. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, the child is the father of the man. By the way, bonus points, any PG Woodhouse fans, if you can write in and tell me someone said that, the boy is the father of the man, about Bertie Wooster. If you can tell me which character said that, the boy is the father of the man, we can't send you a prize, but we'll remember you in our prayers. So there we go.
I couldn't tell you, but yeah.
Well, yeah, the character in question, here's a clue. He has a connection with a school. So there we go. But that's the kind of story we like, anything lighthearted, because quite honestly, folks, we say away with darkness, away with division. Again, like I said last week, in the outside chance that this collection of ones and zeros is out there listened to in 100 years' time. We're recording this in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone's heartily sick.
Hopefully the end.
Hopefully towards the end, yeah. But everyone's heartily sick of it. And also there are some terribly, rightfully worrying things going on in America right now, in the USA, I should say. And we give those our due attention. But this little podcast, we hope, is a home of lightheartedness, of stories like that. So anything like that. Anything also like if you maybe painstakingly build up your child's height chart, or a child you know locally, you do that thing with the pencil mark on the wall, and then you do that for years, and suddenly you have to move, and you've got one of those magic eraser sponges. It all has to go, those years of growth, in one little sweep of a magic sponge. And you think, what do? Do I photograph it? Do I knock the wall out and keep a chunk of it? So anything like that, even tiny moments like that, or stories about making a proper Charlie of yourself, like I did. All right, moving on, because we don't want to shortchange you. That brings us to another point, which is that Cece and I, I'll let her get a word edgeways in a minute. Cece and I do want to make this podcast about more than just us. By golly, we do, because like we said last week, there's nothing more of a nightmare, really, than Matt Bullen and Cecilia going on about their love life. But we also do want to make sure that we're honest about the relationship. We don't want to dwell on it. We don't want to be guilty, to use an old-fashioned phrase, of airing our dirty laundry in public. But we think that, again, to use that word I used last week, in a journalistic way, we want to make sure that we give you a pretty rounded view of our age gap marriage, of how it started, the challenges we've had. We don't want to just airbrush that, say things like, well, that was the marriage, and then we had a couple of hard times, and let's move on. That's not fair on the audience. But also, what's a bit awkward for us recording this, and I mean, literally, we're sitting here, I'm on a little wheelie office chair, and Cece's sitting up on a nice dining chair. But as we sit here on a Monday morning recording this, we're nervous. We're nervous because we don't rehearse this. We don't rehearse these podcasts. We talk about a running order. We certainly haven't rehearsed the next bit. It's about, so far, by far the most difficult period in our relationship. So where we left off with episode 1 is that we'd met in the October, but complete randomly at a supermarket, and we'd started dating and fell in love. Really, that covers the next couple of months, and I proposed.
We got engaged quite quickly. I think you proposed to me like in a week. Then maybe a month after that, I moved in with Matt. I was living with my roommate just across the park. But yeah, we got on very well. But for sure, I was partying a lot, as was Matt. Or partying more like we were going out and we were drinking like a lot. That definitely played into problems we had later after we were married, which was after Christmas.
As we were setting up this morning, I said something to Cece that I've said a lot of times before, which is that the real virtue of our first several months together, we think, is that although they were quite giddy and quite turbulent, they had the virtue of bringing us together, and we got married, fell in love and got married. But what happened after we had a lovely winter, didn't we, after we were married on that Christmas Eve. We had a lovely winter, and we've got photograph after photograph of us throwing snowballs in the local park. We were still living in Columbia City in South Seattle. What did you think of that time, of that winter we had together for until about the early June, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was lovely. It was really lovely and, blissful.
Blissful. Then what happened was that we started to argue a bit more. I think, and again, I'm looking at Cece, I think really the problem, unsurprisingly, is that we just didn't know each other very well.
No, and neither of us were working, and then I got a job I didn't really particularly like, and it was stress about money and just those old classic things and we jumped into everything so fast that made it difficult, yeah.
What certainly didn't help, and this is really the thing that it's incumbent on me to dwell on for a couple of minutes, is that I was drinking too much. I had been drinking too much every day for a long time, certainly since I stopped working. I was busy looking for a new direction in my career, which had been working for many, many years in children's healthcare. For the previous 8 years, I'd been working very directly, very intensely every day with parents and families directly. And it's not the place or the job of this podcast to fill your mind with some of the things that I saw and heard about, but I think you can imagine what I did. But I had been drinking, I'm an English lad, I like my beer, and I began drinking more and more. The tax rules between Britain and America are very different, and in Britain, the stronger beers are taxed and the most expensive. But in the US, those are the cheapest beers, and there was one brand of them that I was very, very fond of. I drank a lot of those each day, every day, and then maybe adding on wine as well. It really got too much. It began to affect my dealings with Cece, who I was trying to read, who I didn't know so much. As I say, alcohol certainly played a part, not just in our arguments, but also in my life generally. We used to hang out in our neighborhood a lot. There are various local haunts that we enjoyed going to. And by the way, side note, as I said last time, Columbia City is a terrific neighborhood, as is the one where we live now, First Hill. So give them both your time. They've got tremendous restaurants, beautiful little cinema in Columbia City called Ark Lodge Cinemas that's independently run, just tremendous. We went there yesterday, actually. I began to get I began to get not a very good reputation around the main strip of haunts that we used to go to, that main area of the main road that runs through Columbia City. Honestly, I was drinking so much that I was a blooming nuisance. And if you were around then, or if you know me and I spoiled your drink with your friend or whatever it might be, then hereby I apologize for that. I was a complete nuisance, complete bore, and I'm sorry. So let's move on. We had only known each other, remember, a few months, and then I'll let Cece take over about how things came to a head early in the summer and the decision she made.
Yeah, well, we went to meet my family in DC, and then that didn't go well because lots of things, but drinking as well. And then I came back a little bit later. Matt left DC and came back to Seattle. And I stayed with my family in DC for a few more days and then came back. And I came back and we were fighting so much, and it just was like we needed more space apart. So that space apart ended up being quite a long time between.
It was about a year, wasn't it?
It was a year, yeah. But I'm trying to think of now. It was a year, 2019 to 2020. Yeah. I left in the midsummer of 2019, and I didn't come back until the next year, until the summer of 2020. I mean, it was sort of off and on, but something that was a big turning point was when Matt got so ill and was in a hospital when I wasn't there.
Yeah, what happened was that...
Scary point, though, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, Cece, that you left to get some space for certainly, I think you named towards the start of your time away, you said maybe you were going to be away for 2 or 3 months. Then that extended. Then this was over the summer. We're talking about now summer 2019. And I was still looking for work, still drinking. Things came to a head. Do you remember I ended the last episode by saying that someone 4,000, 5,000 miles away and their efforts combined with those of my first wife saved my life? Well,
they did, yeah.
Yeah, they did. And then this is what happened. The reason that this episode is called Always Call Your Mum on Her Birthday is this, because there is a moral to this episode, and that very distinctly is the moral. My mum's birthday in the middle of January came and went in England, and she had not heard from me. Now, that is very unusual, because I always make a point of calling her, as well as hopefully sending her something that might arrive a bit late occasionally, but I always call her on her birthday. In January 2020, that did not happen. And the 18th of January, 17th, 18th, 19th came, still no call. So I think on the evening of the 18th, she called my first wife. And she said, can you just drop around to Matt's apartment? Because we've been separated a long time. Can you just drop around to Matt's apartment and see how things are? Just because I haven't heard and I'm a bit worried. So I think she had, even from that distance, sort of mother's instinct, you might call it. My first wife said, sure, I'll go round. By the way, something else that I did not mention in the first episode unintentionally is that I have a son who's just the most tremendous human being, currently at college. I can't really believe he's an adult now, but he's 18. That's the son I had with my first wife. So she and he got into the car and came round to my apartment in the evening, saw all the lights were on, then just carried on back home and reported back to my mum, said, all the lights were on, we think he must be fine. And my mum said, look, I know Matt, and sometimes he likes the radio on and a light on, even overnight, somewhere in the house, he does that. And she said, I'm not convinced. Can you try again? My first wife said, fine. Next morning, she got into the car. I think on the way she dropped off our son, he was then at high school, dropped him off, went round to my apartment, and this time, I think she still had a front door key. But anyway, she decided to investigate. Even she sensed that something was not right. And I'll have to get back in touch and get the exact story. But
well, I remember she told me she was too scared to go in alone. So she called the fire department.
That's right. She was too scared to go in alone, so she called 911, not knowing what she might find. And they came. And they came in, and I was unconscious
On the floor.
on the floor.
For days.
Yeah, and I'd been that way for days. And they said that had she not found me, that combined effort with my mum, had she not found me and called 911, because I was rushed straight to our local trauma hospital, that I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast today. In fact, I almost certainly would not have been. I'd been unconscious for probably a couple of days. I got to hospital and I was in a coma for another week, so about 9 days in total. The doctors were saying, well, we think he's probably out of danger now because we've got him stabilized, we can see his signals, but they started to detect a pneumonia and fever. When after 9 days I did begin to wake up, I had a cough. Now, remember, folks, this was mid to late January 2020. So, yes, it did cross recently me and my doctor's minds that this might have been a very early case of COVID-19 as well. And my doctor has committed that possibility to paper. And I've had several comments from other clinicians who have seen my chart and said, it's possible. But you know what, like that guessing game you do with crossbreed dogs where you try and guess where they came from? We don't know. It's just all a marvellous guessing game. But what was certainly, at least partly, probably largely responsible was alcohol. I remained in hospital until the 29th of January, so a couple of days, 2 or 3 days awake on the ward. And you know what? Of course, people's first thought was to tell Cece, who was back in her home state.
How it happened was you hadn't messaged me or called me back, and we were still in contact, and that was weird. And then I contacted or found a way to contact Vera, I think on Facebook Messenger. I think I still had that then. And she let me know what happened. And then, you can call the hospital and they'll get you through to the room. But you sounded so different. It was it was very scary. But then, you came to and they talked about having to get rid of your liver, get you another liver, which they didn't have to do. And it's just when people are in the hospital, there's so many things up in the air. But, I felt terrible not being there. And I was on vacation with my dad and my aunt at the time in Arizona. But anyway, it was such a great thing that you got out of there and we're back to yourself, which for a while it sounded like, oh, was that not going to happen? Was your brain too damaged from the coma or whatnot? But it all turned out for the best, really.
Waking up in hospital with whatever was wrong with me was hard. I reflected on my first quarter century or so in Seattle, and I had Cecilia, a wonderful family. I had worked for those close on 20 years in children's healthcare. We'd had some adventures. Vera, my son, and I, we'd spent a couple of years in New Zealand. In Seattle, I had also worked for 5 or 6 years in search and rescue tracking for a unit working for the special operations branch of a local sheriff's office. I'd done a lot, and a lot of it was not there anymore. My son was, and I was on very civil terms with my ex-wife, and I had family support, a few friends. I very, very much regretted the worry I had caused everyone, especially those close to me. But it was tough. Having been that close to death and trying to rebuild, I think what you have to do is, and I don't mean this in sort of a difficult, clenched kind of way, but you really just have to keep going and keep your nerve. You have to try and look past, often look through, or try to look through all the difficulties, all the challenges, face them for what they are, but you must keep sight on what's past those, or what you can endure. Yeah, keeping your nerve. That's very important. And use your imagination as best you can to help yourself picture different scenarios and different possibilities about what hopefully is your life ahead as you work to recover. I know you're hearing a lot from me this episode. Sorry about that. But I also want to thank everyone on my and Cece's side of the family for all your love and support, and everyone else who's supported me, or at least put up with me. Thank you so much. Returning to Cece, and what I want to make crystal clear, in case anyone listening thinks, well, why didn't Cece just rush back, whatever? The answer is that as far as I could make sense and scrape a few brain cells together, I did not want her there. Neither of us had a lot of money, and an airfare back at short notice would have been expensive. But more to the point, I was in no fit state to make it worth her time. I was walking a few steps using a walking frame. I had to relearn that. I had to relearn several mental processes. As I record this podcast, I'm still not 100% right. So anyway, love, you were going to say?
Everyone told me not to see you.
Yeah, and
your ex-wife and family, my family. People recommended that I didn't come see you because at the time we weren't sure if we were going to stay back together, and that would have gotten maybe your hopes up for something that wasn't going to happen. So yeah, it was just a really hard time for me. So all the voices Cece was hearing just over a phone line were "don't come." So as I say, I want to make that clear because that's the true story, and I was the main voice in that as far as I could be. Then one of my sisters came over from England and was tremendously supportive, stayed with me at my apartment for 12 days as I started to get back on my feet. My other sister was very supportive from England, as of course was my mum, and a special word for my son, who was still technically a child, who's just the most compassionate, brainy person you'll ever meet, sweet-natured with it. He was tremendous through this, as was my first wife, who saved my life in conjunction with my mum. I stayed by myself for several months, and, it's difficult to convey as I talk into this microphone how much I thought that was the end of my marriage to Cece. The only thing that I did was that she had left her first piece of art she'd ever bought, which is a photo of Marilyn Monroe, which we had on the wall. And I talked to Marilyn every day. And she also had something on her makeup stand just to help her drape things over. And I talked to that every day for some reason. I still do, as a matter of fact. But that was the only thing. And even then, it was just to sort of keep a tiny little pilot light of hope left. But I honestly, as I speak to you now, I thought we were headed for the divorce court. In fact, I talked to her family about that when she was feeling it a bit difficult to get the bureaucracy and the logistics of that worked out. Yeah.
I talked with her dad, and we were that close. And then something happened. This is where we said we want to keep this podcast generally light and away from darkness. So this is where we turned around. I'd said to her father quite genuinely, and it felt like dropping an envelope into a dead-end lane because I really thought the marriage was over. I said, look, I really just want whatever makes her happy. And if that means divorcing and finding another way forward, I said, that's what I want. I didn't think any more of that comment, but it came back because soon Cecilia and I started to talk a tiny bit more often on the phone. And one day she said, Matt, I just don't like the thought of the actual process of getting divorced. The scraping of chairs in the courtroom and that whole thing. And she said, really, I just don't want to face that day soon. And I said, look, we're still husband and wife. I'm in no hurry to get divorced because I could tell she was stressed. And even then, I wanted for her to be comfortable and happy. So I said, this can take a month if it has to. And at the end of that phone call, before we moved on to other topics and agreed just to keep things ticking over, I just remember saying, almost as a joke, I said, well, you still are my wife. So I said, I'll speak to you soon and love you. Goodbye, wife. And she sort of chuckled and said, okay, goodbye, husband. And that was in the spring. And then gradually we talked more and more. Then the topic came up of maybe she could visit for a few days. Then it was a few weeks. Then eventually we said, well, why don't you just come back and we'll at least try to make another go of things. We got into the following summer, so we'd been apart that year. She said, okay. she said, I've got some family stuff over the next few months I have to be back for. Nice stuff, lovely stuff to do with babies. And she said, I'll have to go back to that. But she said that gives us a month to at least, as it were, prowl around each other and test each other out again. Anything to say at that point, love?
Well, yeah, it was great to get back together. It was whirlwind getting together, and then
So then in July 2020, you flew back, and we knew it was only going to be for whatever it was, a month, 5 weeks, because there was the joyous family business you had to get back to for a while after that.
yeah, that's right. So we did well, and then had a fun time together, having been away from each other for a year, and then we I went back home because my sister had a baby, and then returned in September, and we took up sort of where we left off.
The year, what we concluded, and everyone close to us concluded, was that we needed that year apart. In fact, sometimes I think that for anyone who gets married, it wouldn't be a bad idea to get married, have maybe 3 to 6 months together, and then have 3 to 6 months apart, just because when we did get back together, we had solved actually a lot of those problems. I wasn't drinking at all, and it's now been well over a year as
Yeah.
we speak since I have had anything to
Yeah,
drink.
which
And
is
what about you,
amazing.
Cece? Were you doing any?
Well, I got a new job here, which I enjoy, and then that helped me feel more established in Seattle. Sort of a piece of the puzzle that was missing, I think, when we were together before. Bit of structure. We moved. We got a new apartment together. That wasn't, it was new to both of us, which is exciting. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's worth saying too, because Cece had come into an apartment that had effectively been a little family home for me. And so there were all kinds of, quite understandably, artifacts and photos and things of
Yeah,
that.
and you feel a bit like you're walking into someone else's life, and that's can be hard. So it's fun to start over together in a new place.
And in fact, it was, in a way, it was a shame because I'd been in Columbia City for 12 years. You'd been there on and off since 2018. And we loved it, didn't we?
It is lovely. I mean, doesn't mean we don't live there again. Just it turned out that where we're living now, closer to my work downtown, and it was just a good opportunity that saved us a lot of money. So
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people can relate to rent being so expensive. If you find a cheaper place, that can be a huge draw. So
Yeah, and we're recording this actually in our new apartment that we've been in since Christmas 2020. We always seem to do significant things around Christmas. Have you noticed?
yeah,
And this apartment is 120 years old.
and you can tell
Yeah, you can tell.
in good ways and in bad ways.
And again, the theme is coming up again. Age gaps, time markers. And I know that this used to be, I don't know if this exact apartment, but in one of these apartments, I think the only female pioneer in her field of business in Seattle in about 1900, she lived in this building. It could have been in this apartment. So the same creaky floorboards that we're in now.
Yeah.
Had Cece been at the age she is in about 1900, she might have had an introduction to this lady and been fighting her way up through the mud and the noise and the logging of early Seattle up the hill past Pioneer Square and just up the hill to where we live now. So as I said last time, we've got echoes of Seattle's history all around us. So we love our new apartment. And again, I tell you, 2 neighborhoods, go to Columbia City and go to Pioneer Square, First Hill, that neighborhood. Both of them have made very ingenious efforts to try and pick up from the pandemic, and they deserve your custom. Where were we? Oh yeah, so Cece came back. And I think really, honeymoon's the wrong phrase because that's too temporary, but when you came back, and I think what we're still enjoying now, is that period of early marital stability and getting to know each other, exploring and building a home that we'd missed in the whirlwind of those first difficult few months. Would you agree?
Yeah. It's been lovely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it has. Recording this episode actually has been quite a challenge because it was hard for us to talk for those 10 minutes back then about the dark time that we went through, because it was a dark time. It was very bleak, But now, thankfully, our life, and we hope it continues, is full of light. I mean, literally, even the windows we have in this apartment are those old windows that almost stretch from floor to ceiling. And we've got a corner apartment, so we look out over the tip top, as we said last week, of Smith Tower, and it cheers you up every time you see that little tower. And we're just doing the things that I almost said young couples. Listen to me, Cece. We always joke about that, because I say that we behave like a young couple and then forget that I'm 51. I'm twice your age, but what would we call it? Recent couple, not young couple, but we feel young, and we're young to each other too. So that's important.
Definitely new.
But when Cece came back, these age differences keep bumping up, often, usually in funny ways. We keep bumping up against each other. One of the most curious that we wanted to mention to you today, of all things, is our attitude to social media. Of course, we're using social media to get the word out about this podcast, among other things. And maybe you can talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so I got Facebook when I was maybe 14, 15, and it was not good for me. There's a lot of bullshit and competing, fear of missing out, counting your friends like their currency, which is not how friendship should be, and that kind of thing. It wasn't to my liking, though there are great things about it, especially keeping in touch, like when people are out of the country and whatnot. And if you love to do it, then I know so many people, you make a career out of it. You can really build your career online. But it wasn't for me. And I left it maybe in 2014 or 2013, which was unheard of. Like, no one really left Facebook. In my friend group anyway, I was 18. So I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do this anymore. Then when I met Matt, he convinced me to rejoin, which was a mistake. And I left less than a year after that. I just don't like it.
Yeah,
but Matt loves it.
You sort of put your head around the door of Facebook again and then very quickly ran away again, didn't you?
Yeah, I don't enjoy it. And I find that true friends I've had in my life, you actually still keep in touch even without it. So that's nice. But Matt loves it, and you post often and have lots of fun conversations and everything else. So so there's an interesting difference between us, because you would think I'd be more into posting and sharing, just because of my age. But yeah.
Well, I think what I pull from this is that both you, you're 26, and my son, who's 18, both you of pretty much the same generation. And you don't touch social media, either of you, with a 10-foot pole. My son's the same. He's not on Twitter, Facebook, nothing. You seem allergic to it.
Well, and it feels like work. And it also feels like people I know personally, and also just in the news, people that get in a world of trouble for things that they posted maybe 10 years ago. And that's one thing if maybe you join when you're 40, now you're 50, because maybe your views don't change. But if you're like 15 to 25, you can say some really dumb things and then get in trouble and maybe lose job opportunities or relationships or anything like that. But I will say this, when I came to Seattle before I met Matt and I was dating on like Tinder and stuff, it's very hard not to have social media, especially for, I think, younger people doing online dating, because it's basically like you don't exist. And I've applied for jobs that have been like, well, you know, how many Instagram followers do you have? And I'm like, oh no, I'm not going to get this job. You know, for more trendy places like being an assistant to someone, or maybe I'm working even like a couple like cute stores around here, you know, clothes shops, you need to have social media because that's kind of part of the job. But then anyway, that's a whole other thing. But yeah.
But, you know,
I see the necessity of it almost scares me. But I know people who have fabulous careers who don't use it. But just depending on what you want to do, it can be extremely helpful.
And before we get off the subject of dating, I don't want to lose the topic of social media, but that reminds me what was interesting about the year plus apart that Cece and I had is that both of us kept track of the number of dates, of partners we had during that year apart from each other, and you kept a note of it. How many did you have, Cece?
Wait, what do you mean, dates? I didn't have any. Yeah, I wasn't dating. Wasn't interested in dating. I was so sad.
So your answer is 0, right?
Yeah.
I've got my notebook here. I kept a track of it too.
How many?
0.
Dates. Oh, good.
So that was really another sweet thing. When we compared notes, I remember having a phone call when we said to each other, I'm not really interested in anyone else. I really just miss you. And much as that sounds like a scene from a TV movie of the week, that I think that really happened. We
Yeah,
really did
and
just say that to each
yeah,
other. And I said, I just want you back.
yeah,
Very limply, but truly.
yeah. And I mean, I don't know our numbers, but I'm not a huge dater of people for sure. So that was not something I was interested in doing. Don't know
No,
what I would have said either. Yeah, I'm
no,
married, but don't worry about it.
no. And in
But
fact,
yeah.
when I talk about that period to my mum, she says, Matt, whenever I was on the phone to you once or twice a week, she said usually at some point in the conversation you would say, Mum, I just want my wife back. And
Yeah.
I didn't realize I said it quite that much. But anyway, back to social media. So you've got you people, and I think I think the reason I'm harping on it is that this happens more than one would think. That people of your age and my son's age feel very suspicious of and allergic to social media, whereas people of my generation and the generation a decade or two older, I think, embrace it. But here's the crucial thing. My dad taught me about fire. Fire, as in flames fire. He said, Matt, always remember it's a good servant, but a deadly master. And that's Facebook's the only social media thing I do.
Well, and there's a bit of
But I only do it for like 10 minutes a day max, I'd say, usually.
well,
Sometimes
I
a
don't know
bit
about
more.
all
If I'm
that.
following a thread, like when we did the podcast and there was some reaction to that, to the first episode, and I was on it a bit more then because I had to respond. Anyway, sorry, love.
Yeah, no. Well, no, I probably sounded harsh about it at first. It's not my brand of strawberry jam, but I know other people enjoy it, and that's great. Yeah, it's not for me. Oh, what was I gonna say?
I don't know, but I bet it was good.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say. So, I think I remember before Facebook, there was MySpace, and I maybe was like 11, and I think my sister had one. But see, at that time, it was really cool and exciting and fun. And then MySpace was a different kind of program because you could customize it a lot more than Facebook. Facebook, MySpace, you made your own background. It's basically like making your own little website for yourself, which to a tween or a teen is like really exciting. Facebook felt like basically people like Big Brother watching you. That's how it felt to me. I remember I went to a party. No, I went to a protest. They called them slut walks, and they do them in different cities. And basically, it's like to benefit people who are victims of sexual assault and whatnot. And you kind of dress in a provocative way, but go, I should be allowed to do this because often people are blamed for what they were wearing on the night that they were assaulted or the day that they were assaulted. And so women and men got up and stood up wearing those outfits and talked about their experience. And it was a really amazing thing. I think I was 17. I remember I got so much kind of heat from it because like one of my uncles saw that I went to it, messaged my mom, what's a slut walk? He didn't know what it was. He took it like literally as like, oh, she's coming like out as a promiscuous person. But it just sort of felt like that, like people catching up on you. And there was lots of other things that happened like that in high school that were like, maybe you tell someone you can't hang out, then they see pictures of you the next day and you were hanging out with other people. And it just seemed like too much kind of surveillance a bit.
Well,
Yeah.
listening to you, I'm reminded that if any of our listeners listen to British radio and listen to some of the gambling companies who put out
Oh, yeah.
advertisements, that I think
yeah.
that either they choose to or the government has asked them to,
Yeah.
to use the following phrase at the end of every commercial, which is when the fun stops, stop. And I think that applies to social
if we're that
media.
easy though,
Yeah.
with gambling.
Oh, with gambling.
But even with
it's
social
not.
media,
I'm not taking gambling
Yeah.
lightly, but it applies to social media. That's what I was going to
when I
say.
was
When
leaving,
the fun stops,
yeah,
stop.
when you try and get rid of your account, which is a real thing, like when you get rid of it, it doesn't just go away. They give you a 30-day grace period window where your account's still up. But they go, this person will miss you and that person will miss you. And they do whole like memories photo montage at you that makes you quite sad because it's like family and friends and you're like, oh no, I shouldn't leave. They're very good at marketing it. And it's changed so much. I mean, the amount of ads and selling and money that can be made on Facebook is just amazing. So that's kind of a cool part of it. But
Well,
yeah,
as the fellow said,
a lot of, yeah.
the prospect of death concentrates the mind. But another thing that concentrates the mind is the prospect of making a great deal of money. So people get very good at manipulating and reading other people when they know that there's a couple of $100,000 bonus at the end of it.
Yeah,
So
very
they
true.
get very good at doing photo montages
But
and
then
saying
it gets
and massaging you
yeah,
back.
no, that's true. That's true. Yeah. I think sometimes sharing things or putting things online. It's good, but also I don't know. I think it's good to live in the moment. And sometimes when you're with people and they're trying to take a picture for Facebook and post it, it changes it. They're not just with you anymore. They're with all the people that are going to see the picture. And is this the right one? And it robs you of being in that moment because you're like, maybe you're at Disney World or maybe you're at a winery or whatever and you're like trying to just have a good time. And it's like, oh, we got to get a photo for Facebook to kind of prove that we actually went instead of just being there.
Well, and and again, isn't this funny as we go back to our theme of age gap? Because I'm not bad. I'm not one of those people who, and this infuriates me, who will, when you go to a concert, everyone else there has their phone and they're concentrating on trying to see if the viewfinder on their phone is getting a good view of the gig rather than actually enjoying the gig.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not that bad, but of the two of us, I would say that when we're out having a fun time spontaneously, I'm the one slightly more who says, oh, let's get a photo.
Yeah.
And Cece usually rolls her eyes. So again, it's against the stereotype that one would think. I'm not bad. I hope I don't spoil days out for us. But if anyone, I'm slightly more of that.
And I mean, sometimes I'm grateful to have the picture. I just like having the picture being mine and not having to immediately post it to feel like the thing actually kind of happened, which you're not that way either.
But this we're conscious, as I say, now we're back together and just loving our life now that things have settled down. Something else we love to do, and that Cece, in fact, missed more than I did, is that since the virus and lockdown began, you've been longing to go to the movies.
Yeah.
And you really miss that.
I really, really, really do.
What? And what is it? Why? What did you miss?
Just magical. I just love the dark room, the huge screen. Is just, I think it's how you're supposed to see movies. And I really do love movies. And I have a very difficult time. I don't have a computer. I watch things on my phone or I'll watch it on RTV, but it's very hard to focus. So you can just focus and enjoy it. And yesterday we saw Nobody with Bob Odenkirk, and it was so fabulous. And it had so many good action scenes, which sometimes can be boring, but this movie did not make them boring at all. And it was funny. So it's just such a treat. I love seeing movies. I'd see them all day if I could.
Yeah, and by the way, I promise you guys that I'm not in the pay of the local commerce group or anything, but we did go back to Columbia City yesterday on the train. It takes about 10 minutes. We went again to that little Arc Lodge Cinemas, which is an old-fashioned place.
It is so nice. Little theaters are great.
Yeah. But like a lot of those little theatres, and by golly, they're worth your time and money because they've actually invested, once you get in wonderful sound and seating. So they're a combination, aren't they? Of the old...
they have great sound. It's obviously smaller theaters. It's not like a big multiplex cinema, but it's just so much fun. Really something that I had missed. And you had missed too.
We'd missed, and as you will tell, that some stories have a definite setting, have a backdrop, have a location, and some don't. Ours did, which is why we keep going back to this zip code 98118, Columbia City, because that undeniably was the scene for the good times and the challenging times for the first years of our relationship.
But yeah, it's a very quaint, nice neighborhood. And I grew up in the suburbs of DC, and I never knew a little village-like neighborhood like that. I'd never lived somewhere like that where you saw the same people at the grocery, at the restaurants, at the bars, or the clothing store or whatever. I never, there was no high street. There was none of that. It was more it's just the suburbs. So it's a lot of, what's the word? Shopping strip malls, strip malls. And that's just different. Lots of chains, places that aren't unique to where you are. So not as much identity there. But yeah, it was so nice in Columbia City. And
what's lovely, what's charming, and I think, listen to me, listen to the hubris of this, Cecilia. I think if Jane Austen was here, she'd agree, is that really, though, somewhere like Columbia City is just like a little English village beneath the USA 2021 exterior and all the brands and all the cars and all the furnishings of 2021. It's just a little village, isn't it? I mean, people know each other, people see each other, word gets round about things.
Yeah.
But it's got British listeners, if you know the Old Kent Road in London, a very historic but not a very glamorous road, there's somewhere called Rainier Avenue that ploughs through the centre of Columbia City, and it's really the centre of that hive of activity. And there's so many places there. We know Columbia City Ale House, Rookies, Lottie's, the Hummingbird. There's lots of others. Those are just the ones we know. So again, we're not paid by any of these people, but there's lots of others that are great. Little stores like Andalous. So there's a bakery there. We think highly of it. But going back to the movies, I was saying to Cece that I don't think I missed it quite as much as you. But when we get in there, it evokes in me when I was a kid back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I was saying that I still remember, and it was this term, it was a very female term. You had usherettes. They had a uniform and they had little muted flashlights that had that kind of dull orange plastic around them so that when they showed you to your seat, you didn't interrupt other patrons' attention. And then they had these square trays around their neck on a big broad ribbon. They had trays of this orange squash drink called Kia Ora. It was in little misted plastic containers with a hard plastic straw, and they were square. And this used to fascinate me. I used to say, Mum, Dad, please, can I have a Kia Ora? And they were about the equivalent of about 10 cents, I suppose. And then it only occurred to me recently, and last night I said it like a startled fawn to Cece. I said, Cece, I realise now why they were square is that the usherettes could get more of them into their tray and they'd be more stable. They wouldn't spill all over the place because they could slot them in.
Makes sense.
On a grid. So, yeah, cinema in Britain, we used to go a lot. I used to go with my dad.
It sounds lovely. It sounds more full service than now.
It was full service. But, something else we love, and again, wherever you're listening from, please give your patronage to those little local independent cinemas like Ark Lodge, because often the snacks and things are way more affordable.
Yeah, the little ones are great. Yeah. And also they choose really great movies, which I think is cool. You can see movies that you might not be able to normally see. Back where I grew up, there was a theater that I went to a lot, just on my own, all the time, especially when I would skip school in high school and I just
You didn't do
take
that.
my parents' car that they gave me to drive to school and I'd drive to the movies. Anyway, they would have great movies that, like foreign language films and kind of movies that I wouldn't have normally seen, but because the theater has the vision to purchase, I guess, and show those movies, it's great. Because so often the big theaters kind of all play the same movie. It'll be like Trolls 2 HD or whatever, 3D Trolls movies and the Avengers movies. But these are more artsy-fartsy movies, but they're good.
I'm looking at Cece as she talks, and I don't want to be a bore who constantly harps on our theme of age gaps, but when she talks about choosing which movies to see, it reminds me of another difference in our relationship, which is that when again, it's the virus, it's lockdown, so we don't go out a lot, so we rely on indoor entertainment. We've noticed that I am the one who tends to pick these successful TV shows, successful in the sense that we end up watching them for week after week. But Cece is the one who finds all the clips, like on her phone, and all the things, and that separation of duties, as it were, it just works because we have little tropes now in our house and repeats of clips hundreds of times. Living with us it would be a nightmare because all we do is look at the same clips of
Dogs
and Sammy Paradise, old clips from Debbie Downer and all those.
Yeah.
And you are the one who introduces those to the household. Yeah. But I'm the one who says, "Hey, Cece, come and look. There's this show that I love called Jonathan Creek."
Never would have watched, ever, because I just had never heard of them.
And so that's another way that age works, and it does work because Cece used to give me a hard time. She said, "Why don't we watch my TV shows or my movies?" And I said, "Because we sit down and I'll say, can we watch Legally Blonde?" And in the moment,
I'll say no, I don't.
You'll say no, I don't want to watch that.
I get very territorial about certain movies because they have such sentimental value to me, and I've made the mistake before of showing people things and then they don't like them. Not fun. Or they don't appreciate them as you're watching them or something. So I just feel like I can keep this one to myself. But that is one we should watch. I mean, you know how it is. Like, what were you? Well, yeah, a lot of things you show me, and you want me, to have my full attention when we're watching them and not to look at my phone or anything while we're watching them because you don't want to miss something.
I've just gone through vicariously that feeling. Your heart sinks, doesn't it? I remember years ago, it happened with me and that movie, and I had not seen it but I heard of this movie, The Usual Suspects,
Yeah.
and I showed it to my parents, and there's a lot of language in that film. Now,
Yeah.
mum and dad are not prudes; they really aren't. They're not. But for some reason, maybe I caught dad on the wrong night. But the first few minutes of that film have a lot of off-color language,
Yeah.
and he just pretty much walked out,
Yeah.
and that was rotten for me because when you pick a film, you don't know what it's going to be like. But I had it also with my son just a couple of years ago. I said there are a couple of movies like Sleepless in Seattle and Singles that really are filmed in Seattle. And I said, Vince, we should watch Sleepless in Seattle because it's filmed genuinely around the houseboats and you'll see shots all over town. So I sat there with him. He was about 15 or 16, I think. And I sat there. And I sat there, and of course it's a good movie. I'm not having a go at the movie, but it doesn't have quite as much of Seattle, quite as many landmarks that you can point out and say,
Yeah.
oh, there's that, there's the
Yeah.
Space Needle, there's Pine and Pike, there's
Yeah.
there's Smith Tower, whatever it might be, as you think. And so I had that awful feeling where your stomach's clenched because you want the person with you to enjoy it, and that's what you're talking about, isn't
Yeah.
it? And that
Yeah,
happened with your
the-
parents once too, didn't it? You had them watch.
So many times. My parents are a couple of saints because they watch really weird shit that I showed them. Like, I think I made them watch this sci-fi show Westworld, which I was very, very into in like 2016. But it was a lot. Watching it through the lens of my parents, it was an HBO show, so there's like carnage and lots of upsetting things. But I was like, it's so cool. Then I thought, maybe it's cool, but maybe I watched this with whoever had showed it to me and keep it at that. But and the reverse is true. My mom and I see movies a lot together. And one time we saw this movie, its name's escaping me, but it was Meryl Streep and an older actor, and it was kind of like them going to marriage counseling and how like they can't really seem to have good sex anymore because they're in their they're in their 60s. And my mom was like, I shouldn't have taken you to that because it was just it was just the bit awkward to watch with your mom,
Right.
but it was fun. I mean, you just got it. Sometimes you just go and you see.
But sometimes it just works. Like the other evening, and again, I can't help but come back to it. Remembering our ages, when I was
Hope Springs, that's what it was called.
Hope
Sorry,
Springs,
Hope
all right.
Springs. Yeah, that's the marriage counseling one. It was fun. It just was definitely for middle-aged people.
Yeah.
More than me. I think.
But I was just starting to say that sometimes a choice just works. And
Yeah.
again, bearing in mind our different age groups, when I was about 6 or 7, the movie came out, and as I understand it, what happened with Stephen King is that I think it was when he and his wife needed to buy their kids pink medicine. And as I think he might have said, every kid at some point needs some pink medicine of some kind. They were looking to afford it, and he had been writing some short stories. And his wife came into the room and looked in the trash can and said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, it's just something I was working on, but it's no good." And she said, "Well, what's it about?" And he said, "Oh, it's about a teenage girl who's bullied and who, uses the power of her mind to move objects to get her revenge." And she said, "Dig it out and we'll sell it." And long story short, of course, it was Carrie. And I think that his agent went to, I think it was New English Library or someone, and they said something like, "And we're afraid you're a first-time author. We can only offer you an advance of," and they said this enormous sum,
Right.
and I think he had to not to sweat. But that was
fabulous.
Carrie. Anyway, when I was 7 years old, the movie came out with Sissy Spacek, Piper Laurie, PJ Souls, all the rest of them. I was too young to go and see it, but eventually I saw it, and then I saw it again and again, and it's one of my 3 favourite horror films, I think. And I'm not a great aficionado, I'm really not, but Cece was born in 1994, and you'd seen 1 or 2 versions, hadn't you?
I
You'd
saw
seen
one with Chloe Grace Moretz, I think.
And we saw the version one of the versions, the movie that was made about 10 years ago, I think. And I saw it with my son and
Yeah,
first
that's
wife.
the same one.
Yeah. And it is very, we have to tread ever so carefully here not to do spoilers. It's good. It's
Yeah.
very, very good.
Yeah, it was.
But
It was scary.
in ways that we can't say, it does not have the bite in 3 or 4 ways of the first 1976 version.
Yeah.
And Cece was a bit careworn with the whole Carrie, the whole Carrie trope and atmosphere that's floated around ever since Stephen King wrote it. Because, of course, understandably, for lots of very serious reasons, it's beloved of a lot of girls especially. I said, I know it's a bit familiar, but I said, just sit down, and I patted the sofa and I said, just let's watch the 1976 version. You loved it, didn't you?
It was great.
You just
It's
came away.
fabulous.
It's
so
short.
much, it's so
Hour
much
and
in
25
it
minutes.
that you see in other films now, devices they use now.
Yeah, sorry about the noise in the background, by the way. We're going to wrap up in a minute.
Okay.
Let's make that the very end of
Yeah.
this episode. It's been a tricky one for us to record. We had to pause at several points and have a little chat because it's difficult. But we hope we've brought some light and cheer.
Yeah, and go see the movies if they're open
Go see
where
movies.
you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever you've missed, that hopefully will be continuing to open up more and more.
Yeah, thanks for listening. We'll be back with lots more, and please write to us or comment below if you're watching on YouTube, listening on YouTube. We really want to hear from you. aBrit&aBrat@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll look forward to seeing you in episode 3, where we'll say again goodbye to darkness and division. Everyone's welcome on our podcast. We love you, everyone. Thanks very much. Take care of yourselves above all. Bye-bye.
Bye.